Good morning, good afternoon, middle of the night, wherever you are. It's great to have you here. I want to welcome you on behalf of CBA and the executive board. I want to especially thank Joshua Scott for his help in setting up this book event, but I especially want to thank Sherri for her willingness to put her book out there and to allow this event to take place. We're going to have three very good panelists and hopefully a very good discussion about the content and the issues that this book plays out in the academy and the church. As you all know, Sherri Brown, she's our author, of course, and she is the Associate Professor of Theology at Creighton University. Very glad to have her here. Our panel of respondents to the book includes Chris Skinner, who is the Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Loyola University in Chicago. Thanks for being here, Chris. Alicia Myers is from Campbell University Divinity School. She is the Associate Professor of New Testament and Greek, as far as I can tell from the website. Thanks for being here, Alicia. And Hugo Mendez is the Assistant Professor of New Testament at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And welcome, Hugo. So I'm going to turn it over to Joshua now to go over some technical issues with Zoom, although everybody's used to the Zoom by now. But Joshua, to you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. As we move through our panels, the chat is open, and so we invite you to actively engage the conversation. You're welcome to pose questions and comments in the chats. When we move to open discussion, we will also invite you to use the raised hand feature if you'd like to join us on screen during the open discussion. While this is an excellent book and we're excited to review it, the point of the conversation is also to think broadly about the questions that were posed in the initial announcement, to think about the terms of discipleship. And just as a reminder, we've asked our reviewers to reflect on Brown's book with the following questions. What is the nature of discipleship in the early Christian community? What is the nature of discipleship in today's academy and the parish? How do these approaches to discipleship work together or diverge? We look forward to a wonderful conversation, and please communicate in the chat if you have any other outstanding technical questions. Archie, back to you.
All right. Thank you, Joshua. Just to give you a little rundown how things are going to flow today. So Sherri will open our discussion with about a 10-minute presentation. Be followed by Chris Skinner, and then Alicia Myers, and then Hugo Mendez will be the three respondents, and then Sherri will, if she chooses to, have an opportunity to respond to the respondents, and then we'll take a brief 5-minute break, and then we will move into the open discussion for all those who are in attendance of the event to take part in. So without further ado, Sherri, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'll begin by thanking the Catholic Biblical Association and specifically, of course, Archie Wright for giving me the opportunity to present my most recent monograph in this forum. I also thank the panelists for giving their time and energy to this endeavor and engaging with me on the topic of John's quite particular teaching on discipleship through Jesus's imperatives as invitations. As my title indicates, I explore the John the Evangelist's call to discipleship and mission. This summons, however, has not always been at the forefront of the study of the Johannine literature. And unfortunately, when it has been, John's gospel has often been used, abused, and even hijacked to suborn notions of exceedingly high Christology, as well as of discipleship that is insular, sectarian, and anti-Semitic. I would argue that despite these widespread stereotypes, John presents a narrative of the good news that is open, progressive, even feminist, and most importantly, inclusive of all. John calls people in to receive and believe how God is acting in the world now, as God has always done, then sends these same children of God, to use John's language, out into the world to share this egalitarian relationship of love and life in abundance. While leading the foremost catechetical school in the late 2nd century CE, Clement of Alexandria famously characterized John as the spiritual gospel. Clement's intent was not to limit the gospel categorically, rather to appreciate the necessity of all four of them. Although Clement's words were helpful in his context, his depiction of John's gospel has persisted. Indeed, more than any other gospel, John suffers from stereotypes that limit appreciation of its treasure trove of gifts. John does, of course, contribute much to spirituality. That said, John also contributes to understanding the historical Jesus, Christian origins, and the practical lives of believers in relation to society. Nonetheless, these latter treasures from John's trove are often overlooked. One such example is whether John offers any teaching on discipleship and mission. Traditionally, interpreters suggested that John's primary focus is to teach how Jesus is the Christ and Son of God, aka Christology, often to the exclusion of concern for morality and ethics. Such scholars suggest that when John does teach about behavior, his concern is limited to the prescribed community of believers, insiders, and is explicitly unconcerned with social issues in the larger society, outsiders. Recently, however, interpreters are exploring the ethical implications of John's gospel with renewed interest, testing longstanding stereotypes and further challenging traditional presuppositions of what constitutes ethical mandates. Scholars like me and others on today's panel look instead to genre characterization and the action implied in Jesus' teaching through imperative, invitation, and modeling. Correlatively, interpreters like Dorothy Lee, Teresa Akure, Sandra Schneiders have moved away from spiritual interiority, disconnected from this worldly experience, to explore John's approach to mission. Michael Gorman identifies this approach as reading John through a missional hermeneutic. He suggests that transformative participation in God's incarnation into earthly life by way of believing that Jesus is Christ and Son of God and entering into the resulting relationship bestows a divine indwelling union, theosis. This generates an outward turning to mission, inclusion, and active justice-seeking discipleship. My current study builds upon these interests and explores John's gospel as a story of encounters and Jesus' mission in part as relationship building and establishing what it means to be children of God. So 1:12. This is reflected in the title, Come and See, Jesus' first words of the gospel in 139, or part of Jesus' first words. As indicated by Gorman's summary of the Johannine mission to abide and go, Jesus challenges those he encounters to new life in relationship with God through him by imperatives that summon and are often coupled with invitations to go into discipleship. This is a drawing in that has as its telos a sending out to live as Jesus lived. Therefore, I trace the gospel's narrative by way of the invitations through imperatives Jesus issues disciples of all time. Before I proceed, allow me to say a few words about the book's format. It is the 6th volume in a new series from Paulus Press. And so reading from the series preface, this series, Biblical Studies from the Catholic Biblical Association of America, seeks to bridge the gap between technical exegetical work of the academic community and the educational and pastoral needs of the ecclesial community. Combining careful exegesis with a theological understanding of the text, CBA members write these volumes in a style that is accessible to an educated, non-specialized audience without compromising academic integrity. So this was my challenge, to offer something new and relevant both to the academy and to the church, therefore both exegetical and pragmatic, all in 35,000 words or less, which I will now summarize for you in 10 minutes or less. Evidence suggests that John's gospel was written by and for ethnically Jewish Christians who are open to Gentiles and living outside Judea. The gospel's Jewish roots, together with Mediterranean culture and Greco-Roman civilization and rule, provide the historical, theological, and socio-political setting for Jesus, the Jesus movement, John, and his community across the 1st century CE. They also provide the language and symbolic imagery from which the evangelist draws to share his message. John declares his purpose in 20, 30, and 31. He has collected and composed these traditions so that audiences may believe that Jesus is Christ and Son of God. The story is not just about Jesus, but about every human being. The embedded relationship gives life, and John would have everyone included in this life-giving affiliation. There is a focus on separateness, at least from the status quo, but it combines with a hope for active participation, equality, inclusion, and community building that is inspirational. So John summons to relationship and mandate for mission. John's gospel is steeped in the covenantal history of and theology of Jewish scripture. The Greco-Roman world of the community and the gospel it produced, however, call for a story recast in the language and style of that world. Adopting the traditions of Israel for an emerging community of faith, now geographically and spiritually distant from Israel, John narrates God's continuing work in creation through new relationship, thereby reorienting that community toward its future. Jesus is the true revelation of God who fulfills and establishes a new covenant available to everyone. Receiving Jesus as the Christ and believing in God the Father through Jesus the Son is thus the theological summons, while accepting any and every one through mutual abiding love is the ethical summons the good news issues to all who encounter it. Across the narrative, 135 verbs occur in the imperative as characters give commands in one form or another. Of these, 97 or 72% are given by Jesus. Further, Jesus speaks explicitly of the importance of commands and their role in the relationship of faith. For example, as part of his Good Shepherd discourse, he cogently describes his life and mission. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own. I have power to lay it down and power to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So 10:18. In a final summary of his public ministry, Jesus cries out, I did not speak on my own, but the Father who sent me commanded me what to say and speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. So what I say as the Father told me. 49 and 50. This sentiment culminates when, elevating his disciples to their new role as leaders, Jesus teaches of the abiding covenantal love between Father, Son, and believers. He says, if you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. This is my commandment. Love one another as I love you. It was not you who chose me, but I who chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain. This I command you, love one another. That's taken from 15:10 to 17. Across the study, I, therefore, follow John's narrative, examining imperatives as invitations to discipleship as they emerge, considering where and how they occur in the story. I begin with the call to receive and believe Jesus as Christ and Son of God, 1:12, then encounter Jesus' first imperative as invitation, come and see, made to all potential disciples, 1:38 and 39. We see, however, that discipleship is not for the faint of heart, as Jesus charges those who enter into the believing relationship to know the truth that sets them free, 8:31 and 32. This culminates in Jesus' command for his own to continuous abiding and loving one another in community, 13:34 and 35, 15:1 to 27. Some rise to the challenge, others do not, but the hope for all is to have life in Jesus' name, 20, 30, and 31. Therefore, Jesus' final summons to follow me, 21:22, rings a clarion call through the ages. Providing the underlying imperative of the good news, this command emboldens disciples living by Jesus' command to concrete action through believing in God and receiving, believing, loving, and abiding with others in the world. Above all, John challenges audiences of all time to move beyond their own perceived limits into both deeper relationship with God and active vocation in the world with one another. I conclude by bringing the claims of imperatives as invitations to discipleship together in a case study that exemplifies these components of John's mission as an evangelist. Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman across 4:1 to 42, unique among the Gospels, encapsulates John's mandate for believers' missions, regardless of race, gender, nationality, or prior self-conception. Jesus' opening question of John's gospel, what are you seeking? And the disciples' question in return, where do you abide, Rabbi? Open the quest for all audiences of John's telling of the good news. The quest is fulfilled when we respond to the imperative as invitation, come and see. In John 21, the evangelist concludes his story by attesting to its limitless nature through Jesus's imperative to follow me. John then turns to audiences of all time to speak directly in the first-person testimonial tradition of the beloved disciple. His final words send audiences into the world and their shared future as children of God, living in the receiving of and abiding in the risen Christ. They have a mandate for mission that entails going out and believing and loving as Jesus did, that is sustained by the truth of participating in the indwelling relationship of God as Father, Son, and advocating Spirit. In John's Gospel, Jesus, Christ and Son of God, challenges the prevailing religious, political, and ethical status quo of his day and any day to encourage children of God of all times to do the same. And thus, disciples of all ages are called to abide and go. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherri. That was an excellent beginning to the discussion. And I'm now going to turn it over to Chris Skinner. Chris.
All right, thanks. Thanks so much. It's great to be here with everyone today. And before I get to the book, I really just want to say publicly, Archie, how much I appreciate your leadership of the CBA in recent years. I've been enjoying these Unbound book reviews. I appreciate your new initiatives and just generally your energy for the society. I think I speak for a lot of people informally when I say thanks for your leadership. So really appreciate it. Now to the book. I have had something of a privileged viewpoint from which to witness the evolution of at least some of the ideas that are represented in this book. Sherri and I have had innumerable conversations about the fourth gospel over the last 20 plus years. But with respect to the ideas presented in this book, I feel I've had a bit of a front row seat to their growth and evolution over the last decade, from an incipient kernel to the more fully developed. For broader context, Sherri and I first started thinking together about ethics in the Johannine literature all the way back in 2014, which culminated in our co-edited volume, Johannine Ethics, The Moral World of the Gospel and Epistles of John, which was published by Fortress Press in 2017. In numerous conversations between us during that project, we explored what it meant to move beyond the stale, indicative, imperative schema that seemed to, on the one hand, dominate discussions of Pauline ethics for decades, while simultaneously denying the Johannine literature a place at the table of ethical discussions. So for that project, Sherri and I decided to spend most of our intellectual energy looking away from the Johannine imperatives so as not to prejudice the discussion of ethics from the outset, at least in the minds of those who insisted on using the imperatives as a primary lens for establishing an ethical system. Nevertheless, Sherri seemed drawn to the imperatives even then, and she eventually ended up writing one of her 2 chapters in our book on the imperative to become children of God. That project was the immediate impetus for her continued thinking about imperatives in greater detail over the next few years. Then at the 2019 annual general meeting of the Catholic Biblical Association at Walsh University in Ohio, Sherri gave us all a research report in which she explored further the Johannine imperatives, taking a step beyond the initial research she had done on their ethical implications. And now here we have this book. We have another stage in that evolution, the Johannine imperatives from an exegetically informed perspective on their relationship to discipleship and then also to mission. In the time I have this morning, I want to pose a few questions about the nature of early Christian discipleship as it relates to this volume, and then pose a few questions for Sherri to consider. First, however, I want very quickly to point out what I see as a few strengths of this book. First, one of the things I appreciate about this volume is how it displays an awareness of multiple related concerns in contemporary scholarship and incorporates them seamlessly into the broader argument. In particular, I'm thinking of Sherri's incorporation of course, work that's been done on ethics and characterization, as she mentioned previously, but also the work of Dr. Michael Gorman on the language of theosis and participation, both in the Pauline literature and in John, and the recent work of Dorothy Lee on spirituality in John. One can sense Sherri's concern for these important ideas under the surface of her own presentation of discipleship in John. Second, as I fully expected, Sherri's argument is textually based and exegetically derived throughout. Her argument stays close to the text at every turn, and even if you disagree with one of her conclusions, your reason will likely not be its distance from the text. And third, I just want to say I appreciate the level at which this volume is pitched. You know, I often tell my doctoral students that academic writing is like making sausage. You know, if you never made sausage, you may not find this to be an apt metaphor, but I've made it. You have your casing and you're just shoving all that stuff in there. More footnotes, more stuff. You're just shoving everything in there. But writing for non-specialists is more like gourmet cookery. You have to constantly ask, what do I leave in and what do I leave out? So I think this book is pitched at the perfect level for this particular series. Okay, so with those words of praise in mind, I want to explore two related questions. One, what is the nature of discipleship in our earliest Christian communities and texts? And two, how does this book help situate its readers in those texts and contexts? So the nature of discipleship in the earliest Christian text and context. This is a question with which I've been wrestling a great deal recently for two reasons. First, I'm on a dissertation committee here at Loyola for one of our PhD students, Shane Gormley, who I will reference later in my paper, who is writing on discipleship in 1 Peter. And second, I am also trying to finish my own book on Mark's Gospel, where one of the chapters is devoted to the theme of discipleship. And both of these projects have recently challenged some of my unquestioned assumptions about the nature of discipleship in our earliest Christian texts and communities. When we think of early models of Christian discipleship, we might be tempted to approach the subject with the more facile mindset of the former Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, who once famously described obscenity by saying, "I don't know how to define it, but quote, I know it when I see it." Somehow we all instinctively feel as though we know what early Christian discipleship was. But when pressed to define it, I wonder how we might respond. In the recent work I've been engaging in the subject, I've seen some combination of the following suggestions. One, early Christian discipleship consisted of or contained some understanding of imitation, some mimetic element, whether imitation of Jesus or imitation of disciples, we can debate. Two, early Christian discipleship consisted of or required certain prescribed behaviors. And then three, early Christian discipleship was somewhat uniform. Now, this last point is perhaps not as often stated as it is strongly implied. For example, some scholars articulate their understanding of the subject, let's just say how it might appear in the writings of Paul, and then insist, or at the very least strongly imply, that other treatments of the subject must conform to that model, to that understanding. In other words, it's only discipleship in this text, in this corpus, in these corpora, if it looks like the sort of explicitly outlined discipleship we see over here. For example, I know that our Loyola student, Shane Gormley, has been told by some that 1 Peter might not have a theology of discipleship because it does not use the quote unquote standard language we come to associate with discipleship. So for instance, if we don't find heavy uses of the verb akulitheo, we might have to question whether images of discipleship are really present. But I have to say that I find such thinking to lack both nuance and theological imagination. Isn't it possible to describe discipleship? Isn't it possible to describe certain types of behavior and postures toward God without always using the same language, concepts, and imagery? I would argue emphatically, yes. In the same way, the distinctiveness of the fourth gospel often demands that we move beyond the so-called obvious or commonplace to a more nuanced exploration of the Johannine idiolect. And I think that is something this book does. So this moves me to my second question. How does this book help to situate its readers within the text and context of early Christian discipleship? First, Sherri's treatment demonstrates that there is a distinct Johannine grammar of discipleship. And I want to say that I'm borrowing this language from our student Shane Gormley, who is in his own way borrowing this language from Matthew Novinson's very fine monograph, The Grammar of Messianism. In this book, Sherri demonstrates that there is a Johannine grammar of discipleship consisting of various imperatives that combine verbs of movement, come, follow, remain, or abide, cognition, believe, know, sensory experience, see, and all capped off by the affective, love or love one another. To my mind, there is little doubt that this presentation of discipleship is unique among the various gospel presentations and certainly distinctive among understandings of discipleship in the epistolary literature, even where it possesses overlap. Second, I was raised in a tradition that taught that our doctrines come from the epistles and our stories come from the Gospels and Acts. Now, this is, of course, a tradition that I rejected long ago, but I think, and this is something that I think all of us today share in terms of the way we treat the gospel as narrative. I think Sherri's treatment of the imperatives in their broader narrative context reveals much about how biblical narrative is itself a vehicle for theology, for doctrine, for theological information, formation, transformation. And to my mind, maybe one-track mind, all of this has the potential to advance other discussions, but specifically some of the ethical concerns with which Sherri began this research. And then third, there is an important reminder in this book that contemporary Christians are not the only people forced to, quote, ask tough questions and live in open endings. Sherri, I love that phrase. I was really struck by that particular turn of phrase in the final chapter. I think an awareness of the fact that there is some continuity, some real genuine continuity between the struggles of people of faith for all generations is a really helpful way of closing out the book and a really helpful way of situating our understanding of discipleship in the ancient world and connecting it to today. So as I close, I want to pose two questions to Sherri in light of her thinking on this subject. The first is, one of the consistent, and you've already kind of touched on this, Sherri, but not everybody's read the book yet, so this is something you can develop further. One of the consistent claims about the fourth gospel, whether we're talking about the Johannine community or whether we're talking about the Johannine love command, is this idea that John has a distinctly sectarian character, right? And again, in particular, we hear this about John's love command. How would you respond to someone's claim that if John does have a vision for discipleship, it is equally sectarian and limited? In other words, do you see the gospel having normative or universal value for our understanding of Christian discipleship? And if so, can you speak to those elements? So that's my first question. My second question is, can you briefly articulate, since you didn't talk about it as much in your review here, can you briefly articulate for us your understanding of the connection between discipleship and mission in the fourth gospel and why you think that matters both exegetically and theologically? And thank you again for the opportunity to be involved in this.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate your thoughts and look forward to our discussion. We now turn to Alicia Myers and her presentation. Alicia, thank you.
Yeah. I echo everybody else's thanks for the opportunity to be here and also to engage with Sherri's book. As a divinity school professor, I especially appreciate the integration of academy and church concerns because that is something my students they're always looking for, and this is great to be able to give them yet another resource in that direction. So here I go. In her new book, Come and See, Discipleship in the Gospel of John, Sherri Brown tackles questions concerning what it means to be a follower of Jesus, both in the ancient Mediterranean world and today. Since Chris has already covered some questions related to Sherri's exploration of imperatives, I will turn my attention elsewhere, but there will be a little bit of overlap. First, I want to note Sherri's emphasis on the ethics taught by and through the Gospel of John, and she's talked about that already a little bit here today. As she notes, there's a long history of interpreting the Gospel of John as lacking specific ethics for its readers. I believe Sherri is right to challenge this older line of interpretation, along with the other scholars she cites. The Gospel of John does not simply call for its readers to believe as though that's simply a cognitive action, but also to live out such belief in ways that are life-giving. In other words, John has ethics, or for the sake of our focus today, discipleship. Discipleship and ethics are wrapped up in one's beliefs. Sherri writes, receiving Jesus as the Christ and believing in God the Father through Jesus the Son is the theological summons, while accepting any and every one through mutual abiding love is the ethical summons the good news issues to all who encounter it in the Gospel of John. Sherri emphasizes the universality of Jesus's mission, even as she acknowledges the particularity of Jesus's incarnation as a Jewish man from Galilee and in the first century, and that of the Johannine audiences. Receiving Jesus and believing in his identity as God's Son in Christ is aided by the gospel scriptural hermeneutic, which places Jesus squarely in a Jewish and Judean context. Jesus focuses the majority of his earthly ministry within Judea and in conversations with Jews and Judeans. Nevertheless, he pushes the edges of the ethnic boundaries early on with his lengthy conversation with the Samaritan woman. Sherri also suggests the royal official of 4:43 through 54 could be a Gentile, though I would love to hear more on her thoughts about that identity. The gospel also casts Jesus' mission as being for all of creation, the cosmos, a mission that he begins, but is left for his disciples, empowered by the Holy Spirit to bring to completion. In her reading then, Sherri pushes back against approaches to the gospel that suggest it's highly sectarian. I'm sympathetic to this approach because of the gospel's repeated use of cosmos. At the same time, John remains very Jewish. The scope of Jesus' mission is all of creation, but that creation is understood from the perspective of Israel's scriptures and covenant with God. On page 24, Sherri writes, because of the coming of the word into the world, heritage and ethnicity are rendered irrelevant to birth from God. Anyone who believes in the word can become a child of God. I think she's right on the inclusion, but I wonder about the irrelevance of heritage and ethnicity. Perhaps heritage and ethnicity are not a barrier to becoming part of God's family, but it does seem this family is positioned in a Judean and Jewish heritage. The question of how far that heritage is taken is one that perhaps the gospel leaves open. Does John assume a conversion to Judaism for Gentiles or Samaritans? Or could we say at the very least, it assumes a conversion to Jewish monotheistic thought and cosmology? Something to talk about. A key passage for Sherri's understanding of the gospel's universal inclusion is Jesus's conversation with the Samaritan woman in John 4. Sherri's discussion of this scene was particularly enlightening for me when she explored the woman's use of imperatives to Jesus. Not only did the woman receive his imperatives, even if she doesn't immediately comply with them, but she gives her own in return. Sir, give me this water so that I may not be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water, in 4:15. Sherri leaves open the possibility that the woman's response could be either authentic or sarcastic, and maybe even a little bit of both. But regardless, the woman continues speaking with Jesus and even adopts his language, and she does so repeatedly. And in her adopting his language, she opens herself up to his cosmology, which Sherri talks about on page 114. Jesus reciprocates back by adopting her language after her honest response, I have no husband, not only describing her own current situation, which is in parallel to his understanding of where Nathanael was before he came, but also in discussing worship with her in 4:21 to 24. The woman then follows Jesus's lead again by describing her knowledge. As Sherri notes, unlike Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman does not fade from the scene. Rather, she takes a step forward. In so doing, she paves the way for Jesus to give his first explicit acceptance of the title of Messiah and his self-designation with God the Father of both Jews and Samaritans in John's Gospel with the statement, I am. It is after this revelation that the woman finally complies with one of Jesus's commands. She goes, not to a husband, but to her entire city, with belief enough to ask if this man could really be the Messiah. As Sherri observes elsewhere, belief prompts action. The woman not only appears as a disciple, but as Sherri says, as an apostle. I appreciate Sherri's lengthier discussion of this pericope and the Samaritan woman's character for a couple reasons. First, it's a glimpse of the fruit coming in Sherri's longer-term project examining women characters in the Gospel of John. Second, it made me wonder what Sherri's thoughts were on John's putting this story so early on in the Gospel. What is the impact of having the story here, the first story of another woman with Jesus after his time with his mother in 2:1-12, and preceding additional exchanges with Mary and Martha of Bethany, as well as Mary Magdalene to come? How does the Samaritan woman compare with these other Jewish, Galilean, and Judean women? And then third, Sherri's discussion caused me to reflect on how these women were all on the move, so to speak, conveying messages from or about Jesus. Jesus' mother commands the servers to follow her son's words. The Samaritan questions the people of her city. Martha and Mary shuttle to and from their home, communicating with each other, as well as with the Jews mourning with them. And then Mary Magdalene, first in bringing Peter and the beloved disciple to the tomb, and then as the first disciple openly sharing news of the resurrection with the others. What is the importance of this repetition? And what do we lose out on when we diminish or ignore the voices of women in our own communities today? I have a variety of other questions for Sherri, like how does she understand eternal life in John? Her view really resonated with Mary Colo's idea of eternity life for me as I read, and I'd be curious her thoughts on that. What could equality or egalitarianism look like in the earliest Johannine communities when hierarchies are so ingrained in the daily lives and mindsets of these early believers? Or even, how does she understand the incorporation of the pericope adulterae and this woman character in the Gospel of John? I was so glad she at least mentioned the pericope when it is so often ignored, but it made me wonder, especially in church settings where it's one of the most well-known passages, what her thoughts would be. For the sake of time, though, I'll turn my attention more specifically to the questions Joshua sent us for today. According to Sherri's reading, discipleship in the early Christian community of John should have looked like Jesus's life, one that is rooted in an abiding and unbreakable relationship with the Father and faithfully lived out in love, empowered by the Holy Spirit. What this actually looked like in early Christian community, however, remains largely unanswerable. I'm hopeful that discipleship seeks to mirror Jesus's life in local parishes and churches, but as a church member and divinity school professor, I also see how we often fail to live up to this ideal. John's reminder for us to abide and go, or maybe better, while abiding, or even because you are abiding, go and communicate this abiding to others, is a good one. We are not meant just to go, but we are to go while abiding and growing in relationship with God and with one another. This is not a singular discipleship. The question of how such discipleship relates to the academy, however, I find to be a bit more difficult. Certainly, my identity as a disciple informs my scholarship and is a part of my acknowledged perspective. At the same time, academic inquiry needs to be free to question and explore, pushing limits without fear and discomfort. Discipleship in the academy, then, seems better expressed in our relationships to one another. We are to show the love of Jesus in seeking, not competing for, the truth and understanding. Such love expresses itself in trust and honest engagement, even if not always in overtly confessional writing. It's my hope, at least, that this type of engagement retains the universal and inclusive nature of Jesus's mission, a mission that invites people to participate, even if, like the Samaritan woman, they come from diverse faith backgrounds. I see in Sherri's work here an excellent resource for parishes and for churches more broadly, but the ideas she offers are also important for academics to consider as we continue to tease out historical context, implications, and the reception of Jesus's life in the writings that describe it. Thanks.
Thank you, Alicia. That was excellent. Look forward to the discussion. We now turn to Hugo Mendez. Hugo, thank you.
Thank you, Archie. Well, first, it's an honor and pleasure to have been invited to review this newest book by Sherri. Let me start by saying that Sherri has already established herself as not only a skilled interpreter of John's text, but crucially also, and this is the real one, right? An exceptional teacher of the text, translating its thought to academic audiences, non-academic audiences. I'm reminded here of her 2017 book, Interpreting the Gospel of John, an introduction, which I would commend to every person's classroom who teaches on John, co-authored with Frank Maloney. It was a book that deservedly won the 2018 Catholic Presses Association's first place award for reference books. But Sherri's ability to effectively bridge scholarly and lay audiences to help a broader set of publics come and see all that the Gospel of John has to offer contemporary readers is really what's on full display in the book that we're discussing today. And it is, as Chris mentioned, an incredibly rare skill set. There's a tendency when you're presented with two different audiences, a book that's supposed to be in some ways positioned to a scholarly audience and a lay audience, to really satisfy one of them, right? To be pulled in one of those directions. And what I found reading this book is that this is a text that can challenge, inspire, and inform both. It finds that via media between all this, the path that both groups, both audiences can take together to learn together, to grow together. And in so doing, I think it fulfills all the promise of this exciting new series from the CBA. Now, to the book. As Chris and Alicia have already outlined, as Sherri discussed at the beginning, Come and See reads the Gospel of John as a text that draws its readers into a relationship with Jesus, one that can be understood and described precisely as discipleship. And I'll admit to being a scholar who, when first engaging this book, had trouble seeing discipleship, just seeing the cover as a salient theme in the gospel. And I think this is something that Sherri brings out very clearly in the introduction, that we as scholars who work in Johannine studies don't tend to see this theme ever brought out in the way that she does. But as Sherri notes, it is in fact John's Jesus himself who foregrounds the vocabulary of discipleship when discussing the ultimate destiny of the disciples. He tells his hearers in 15:8, "My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples." This is a book that's poised to teach scholars then and lay readers alike what it means to center discipleship in thinking about the Gospel of John. It calls their attention to this neglected thread of John's thinking. The question then that Sherri pursues through most of the book is, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus for John? What is discipleship as the gospel understands it? Sherri finds the answer to this question in the many, many invitations or calls to discipleship woven into and across the text. As she notes, in scene after scene, Jesus encounters various persons, men, women, groups of people, and he summons them with what Sherri calls strong, provocative, and demanding calls, some 97 in all. These include calls to believe, calls to come and see, calls for hearers to know the truth, calls to abide in Jesus, calls to love one another, and calls to follow him. As Sherri notes, these many imperatives have not always, again, been at the forefront of the study of Johannine literature either, often lost in studies that prioritize other interests. Nevertheless, she contends that these invitations to discipleship, these calls to action, are in fact critical to the Gospel of John. They set out the demands of discipleship, the difficult path each prospective follower of Jesus is called to follow. She traces out that vision throughout the book, revealing it to be a multifaceted one. In my response today, then, I'd like to zero in on one dimension, one facet of the Gospel's teaching on discipleship that Sherri distills for us in her work, kind of complementing what Chris and Alicia have already done. Specifically, I want us to consider and talk about the social demands of discipleship, what Sherri highlights as the horizontal dimension of discipleship. As a reader, I was struck by the number of times that Sherri connects her discussions of discipleship to the language of community in the text. We have a tendency to conceptualize discipleship in strictly vertical terms, in that line that connects a master or teacher to a disciple. What Sherri does, what Sherri contends, is that for John, to be a disciple of Jesus is to enter into community, to enter and engage new horizontal relationships. On page 107, for example, she writes that Jesus commands those who would be his disciples to experience, quote, continuous abiding and loving one another in community. And on page 77, she writes, disciples are commanded to dwell in and share that same love in community. Now, at first glance, one might be tempted to think that the evangelist has looser bonds in mind here, that is various forms of friendship or fellowship with other believers. But as Sherri develops the concept in her work, she articulates the idea that all of these messages and imperatives are really oriented towards a single community, a single fellowship. On page 79, she writes that Jesus, on the night before his death, in his farewell address to his disciples, quote, makes God known by consecrating a new community. And on page 106, she says that the gospel, and especially its epilogue, quote, is composed to send audiences, us, out into the world, and as part of this newly formed and still forming community. As I'm understanding Sherri, in John, Jesus creates a single community, and Jesus integrates all believers into that community up to the present. To be a disciple, in turn, then, is to join in and participate in this community. And so towards the end of her book, Sherri tells her readers, we must also live in community with that word and each other as the true children of God. This is what we can call the horizontal commandment. I think these are very important ideas, and I think they deserve deeper exploration. I want to ask and kind of also pose questions to Sherri here. I want to ask, what did this horizontal commandment entail for the author or authors of the text? This kind of question of where did the authors of the text think this community was to be found? Was this community, for instance, the Johannine community of scholarship? There are interpreters, I think, who have read some of this language in this way. I'm thinking of perhaps the most influential article in the history of certainly 20th century Johannine studies, Wayne Meeks's The Man from Heaven in Johannine Sectarianism. Meeks imagines that the gospel directs its readers precisely towards membership in the author's own community. Quoting Meeks, quote, "In order to know the truth, one must join this community, probably a cluster of small congregations, hear its preaching, be instructed in its catechesis, and participate in its ritual." On the other hand, and maybe thinking to a different pole, there are many scholars who tend to think in different ways. These scholars would seem to assume that John only has a spiritual community in mind, perhaps the mystical mutual indwelling of all believers. I'm curious where Sherri sits along this spectrum. To ask the historical critical question, right? Did the author imagine the community that Jesus founded as a spiritual one, or a spiritual one with an external manifestation? If the latter, where was that external manifestation in the author's mind? Was it any worshiping congregation? Was it the author's own congregations, the particular circle, or even, if you will, sect of Christianity that the authors belonged to? How did the authors potentially understand, operating within that circle, their obligations to other Christian groups in light of Jesus' command to love one another, in light of this discourse on community and unity? Now, of course, these questions might seem a little academic. They are historical critical in nature, but there's a real reason why I want to bring them up here. My ultimate aim is to think about how we might make sense of or appropriate this message in the 21st century. To the extent that the Gospel of John still speaks to us today, how do we apply its vision of discipleship in community nearly 2 millennia later? Where is this community to be found? And what obligations does this call for discipleship in community impose on us as modern readers? One question I'd like to ask Sherri is, does the gospel's call to community require participation in a local Christian church, community, assembly, fellowship? Is it possible to follow the bonds of the path of discipleship as John understands it without external social bonds to other Christians? Or are those always implicit in the picture? I think this question is quite salient at a time when fewer and fewer people attend religious services, affiliate with particular congregations. We can trace this decline to various factors: secularization, financial pressures, sports, post-pandemic realities, right? The list goes on and on. But I think it's a question I'd like to hear Sherri discuss. Does the call to community lead us into organized Christian community? Is that latent in the gospel? For that matter, how do we translate this call into the very divided Christian landscape of today? There obviously is no Johannine community today, if that was relevant for the author in tracing this notion. There are only, right, so many Christian traditions that we have, alienated by divergent histories, theologies, rituals. We have those traditions represented in this Zoom call. What does community mean on our divided Christian landscape? Does the call to discipleship in community impose ecumenical obligations on us? Does it drive us to interdenominational cooperation or visible unity in various forms? Or do we need to think of this even more expansively and broadly, maybe less ecclesiastically, and really center it on an ethnic of unity or harmony across a broader spectrum of human relationships? For the sake of time, I'll stop here and let Sherri guide the conversation from here on out. But again, I'd like to take this final opportunity to thank Sherri for what was really a stimulating read, one that I think challenged and transformed how I thought about different aspects of this gospel, and to congratulate her for this latest contribution to Johannine scholarship. Thank you so much, Sherri.
Hugo, thank you for those very intriguing questions. I think it's really going to stir on some really good discussion. I want to ask Sherri now if she wishes to offer a response, a brief response. I know that's going to be hard because there was a lot of questions thrown at you, very good ones from all three of you. It's really, and it's going to really, I think, stimulate some good conversation. But would you like to, or would you like to just have this all be part of a larger discussion? But I want to give you the opportunity if you want to briefly respond to some of the points.
Yeah, I'll say just a few words.
Okay.
I think that I'm in the situation where I either need to say just a very few words or I'll be talking for the rest of the day, because I have to say I'm a bit overwhelmed. Thank you so much to all the panelists for just taking such good time with my contribution to the discussion. Again, I'm just overwhelmed, not only by your kind regards, but also by the numerous and very stimulating questions that you asked, which I can't really do justice to here, but I'll just try to say something to, I'm looking at my notes that I took while you were talking, to what each of you said. Chris's question about sectarianism, yeah, I mean, it sort of goes on, and of course Hugo brought that up as well in John's Gospel. I would suggest that this is the power of, well, it's both the power and sort of the art of narrative and narrative theology that on the one hand, really to sort of address Hugo's question about community too, authors have intended audiences. Now, is that intended audience always a particular specific physical community or of people, or not community, just a group of people, or is the intended audience somehow more universal? I think it can be all those things, either or all of those things. But authors always do have an intended audience. But again, that's the power of narrative, is that, once it gets out there, it's not restricted to that audience. It's open to, audiences really of all time. And I also think that's one of the ways that this issue of sectarianism has really misinterpreted the use of narrative. On the one hand, a lot of Jesus's teaching, especially, in that last discourse, is to his disciples, those who believe. And, John's Gospel specifically doesn't limit the people of that final meal to the 12, but he opens it, to all who believe. And so I think there's something powerful there. But I mean, it's a story. Jesus has to talk to the people who are in front of him in the story. That doesn't mean that they're the only people ever who are the recipients of such teaching. And in that regard, I find his final prayer in that last discourse particularly powerful. 17, 1-26, where you have this very clear 3-part prayer. Jesus prays for himself, for what's to come for him. Then he prays for these disciples here and what they're about to experience, not only in the loss of in his arrest, but everything that he's been trying to prepare them for in the last discourse. And then he concludes by saying, but not these disciples only, but for disciples that of all time, basically, those who come to believe through them. And I think that is very specific, explicit, conscientious on the part of the evangelist, that this is open and goes very much beyond the narrative in front. So, as I said in my opening remarks, I'm particularly interested in Jesus's call for sort of a separateness, at least from the status quo, but that's not the same as sectarianism, right? It's sort of following Jesus's model. He uses this idea of modeling imitation at the beginning of the last discourse and other places. So, living as Jesus did, living with the faith of Jesus. And I just finished teaching a New Testament class, which ended with a lot of Paul. So I've got Paul in my head, even though, and I, not so different, I think, in these ways. With regard to some of, Alicia's comments, Alicia and I have been talking a lot about the role of women in John, and we're both very interested in that. And someday I will actually finish my current project, hopefully soon. But one of the reasons that I chose the Samaritan woman, for that little case study at the end, is I'm just so drawn to her. And I just think that, it's one of the many encounters with women that have really been diluted in traditional interpretation, starting with the fact that, she's a woman of ill repute, which of course is never part of that conversation. But, she engages him in a fairly profound theological dialogue, and more so than, pretty much anybody else in the gospel, and has a lot of agency there. And yet at the same time, when she goes out to, and we were talking about this at lunch at SBL last fall, a group of us, when she goes out to begin to her own mission to the villagers, she uses this construction in Greek that's a construction of doubt, right? A construction that expects a no answer, the may, and could he be the Messiah? And some of us, really want to try to get around that, but I kind of like it. I kind of like this idea that she's just had this profound experience and she's compelled to go, but that doesn't mean she has to be perfect, in order to go. And that also doesn't mean we have to be perfect in order to go. So, actually, and Alicia asked about the woman, the pericope adulterae, which I think we're all trying to rename, the woman ensnared by the Pharisees. Let's call it that.
I've been trying to get my students to call it the woman saved from stoning.
Yeah, that's a good one too. And so Alicia Alicia is asking me to participate in this upcoming special issue. She's going to get to read what I think about the role of the woman caught in adultery. So, and I think that's a very interesting and a very sort of profound, maybe even providential placement of that pericope that was not by the original hand of the author or authors. And then one more thing that I'll say, and then I'll be quiet, is about this, this comparison of John to the others, reading John in light of these other dictates that have been widespread. Even in the writing of this gospel, whoa, Sherri. Even in the writing of this monograph, I encountered some feedback from my peer reviewers wanting me to change that last chapter to a comparison of John and the Synoptics. And I really pushed back because I was like, well, no, this is about Johannine discipleship. And I don't think that we have to compare. I mean, let John be John. Let John have his own voice. Others are writing on the Synoptics or on Paul or anything else. So we compromised, and there's a little text box insert, but that's so fortunately they let me do that. But I was really determined to with this sort of narrative theology and teaching about encountering and relationship and going to just let it be on John. And so, yeah, anyway, thank you so much. I'm happy with how it came out, and I'm so pleased that you all engaged it with me. All right, that was probably more than I should have said, but there you go.
All right, thank you, Sherri. That really opens up us for a really good discussion. Joshua, would you like to just say a couple things? Are we going to have a brief break here, or?
Reflect on the reviewer's comments, as well as address those broader questions to think more about discipleship and the Gospel of John. So if you don't have any other announcements, Archie, let's take that 5-minute break. I have 12 o'clock exactly my time, so let's meet at 12:05, 5 minutes. Well, why don't we come back together again? Again, that we open this conversation up to our attendees, as well as our panelists, to have a larger dialogue about discipleship and John, and kind of to continue the questions that we've been reflecting on here in our first session. Again, as a reminder, we invite the attendees, if they would like to participate in the conversation, to use Zoom's raised hand feature, and we will call on you as time allows. We also invite you to post your questions and comments in the chat. And if you prefer not to come on screen, I'm happy to read them out loud for you, so you are able to participate in the conversation. With that brief announcement, Archie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you.
Archie, you're muted.
Sorry, I must have double clicked it. Well, welcome back, everybody. I want to thank Sherri and Chris and Alicia and Hugo for their very intriguing and stimulating presentations that I hope will now bring some further discussion from those who are in the audience, but also perhaps the panelists want to respond back to Sherri, or Sherri wants to continue responding to some of the other questions that were asked. But we will be watching the chat, and if you do wish to come on screen and ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand and Joshua will be happy to make that happen. So we are open for discussion.
While we wait for others to chime in, I'd love to just take a moment. I was remiss that I failed to thank Frank Matera, one of my old professors at CUA, who was the first general editor of this series, for his invitation for me to submit a proposal and then guidance through the process. He's completed his stint as the general editor, and Sheila McGinn, yes, has come on as the new editor. But I appreciate Frank Matera so much, and I just want to make sure I said that. And also that this was Enrique Aguilar's sort of brainchild that has come into fruition. So thanks to both of them.
If we're still waiting, Sherri, can I just? I know you were taking in a lot, so you might not have caught everything. But can you briefly articulate your understanding of discipleship and mission as they're related in John?
Sure. I mean, I think that they're like fully integrated in the sense that I just think it's a fundamental misapprehension of the Gospel of John that it's all about Christology, and that it's all about believing in Jesus as Christ and Son of God. Because even, as early as the prologue, which Chris and you and I both put a lot of stock in the prologue as our gateway into the gospel. But, he calls people to receive and believe and thereby become children of God. So it's not just about Christology, but it's about people. And again, likewise, in the sort of purpose statement, first conclusion, 20, 30, 31, it's, so that you may believe that Jesus is Christ and Son of God, and that by believing may have life in his name. And that life in his name is I think just as crucial, to the believing, to the believing part of things. So, and what that entails. So Hugo was talking a lot about about the horizontal commandment. I don't know if people are like, what are you talking about? But this is just one of the plays on words, I guess, that I use sometimes when I talk about the believing, the receiving and believing being the vertical commandment between the individual and God. And then, sort of the abiding and loving being the horizontal commandment, the ethics, how we interact with one another. So, discipleship leads to mission, and I think they're fundamentally connected. I hope that helps.
I'm going to ask a question, if that's all right. You mentioned that you were really trying to avoid the whole comparison of discipleship of John with the synoptics, but I'm curious, as this is not really something, because I'm a Second Temple guy and don't really do all this. I do gospel stuff, but so what are some of the contrasts that you see, if there are any, between John's discipleship and that of the synoptics?
Well, I'll say a few things, but then I would invite my panelists who've done work in the other gospels as well, more so than I have, to chime in. I'm not sure if I believe that there's a contrast so much as that it's just a very different way of presenting what discipleship is. When we think of especially, for example, Matthew, and we've got all of this teaching, all of these sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, and all of this where there's really direct teaching, whereas in John, do this, don't do that. But whereas in John, it's much more embedded in, woven into the fabric of the narrative, and it's about relationship and Jesus modeling what it means to live as one who has faith in God with a mission, and then challenging others to join him in that. Other panelists or folks in the webinar?
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick with some thoughts that I've been kicking around recently. I mean, I don't think there's a mimetic element at all to the disciples in John, or really to most figures in John. Right? Almost everybody has some level of misunderstanding when it comes to what Jesus is doing there. I do wonder about it in Mark, though, if we're not supposed. I just finished Helen Bond's book on Mark's biography, which is a phenomenal book. But she says in there that we're really not supposed to see. Early readers wouldn't have seen the disciples as having sort of any imitable qualities whatsoever, or really any sort of mimetic function, because it's a BS. It's all about Jesus, and imitating Jesus is kind of the model of discipleship. For me, it's inconceivable that early Christians would have read the gospel without at least reflecting on the role of disciples and what maybe not to do. So, but I do think there might be some sort of, as I said, even in my paper, some mimetic thing going on in the synoptics that we don't get so much in John. But I mean, in Mark, we have this family metaphor too. Jesus is creating a new family when his family rejects him at the same time as the religious leaders are accusing him of being demon possessed. So I don't know, just some random thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious how Sherri responds to that because of her focus on the beloved disciple as this sort of model. And even if you're saying in Mark, there's mimetic, you can have avoidance, right?
Yeah.
If that can't also still be true. I'm just pushing.
Yeah, I do think I do think the beloved disciple is presented as one. I also think the mother of Jesus is presented in an interesting way at the beginning. And I've said elsewhere, I've kind of challenged this idea of, the mother of Jesus is sort of inaugurating the public ministry, sort of being a model disciple in many ways, sort of before the hour. And then the hour comes in chapter 12, and then we're suddenly introduced to this beloved disciple, not suddenly, but then rises this beloved disciple who's always just right beside Jesus, and in union with Jesus and giving access to others. So I think that they are interesting models there, right alongside models for what it means to be a disciple, as and also, many models of what it doesn't mean to be a disciple.
Well, and certainly if we're going to, foreground center things like going, abiding as being very central to discipleship. I mean, obviously we have, women who confess Jesus in the gospel, women who go and proclaim what they've seen in Mary Magdalene, right? We have, I think, different kind of figures who, I think we've got potentially across the gospel, different sorts of examples of what that could look like.
I agree. And it doesn't need to be someone who gets it completely, right? You can participate even while you're learning, even while you're doubting, which I think is good news for all people of all time.
All right, so we have some questions in the chat box that Joshua is going to either bring the people on or he's going to read the questions for us.
Yes, I'm going to read them out loud. And there's 3 questions that people have posed as they've been reflecting on what you've been saying. T.L. Putnam posed this question. I have long been intrigued by abide as it has an active passivity to it. I'm curious about the abide-go tension and wonder if you could speak more to how John positions these two in relation to each other. If it's okay, I'll ask the other 2 questions and then we can follow through with a little bit longer conversation. Jeffrey Fawcett comments, how does the theme of discipleship in lieu of Christology apply to the Doubting Thomas story in particular? And Cliff Fombello asks, how does the Gospel's forensic language relate to discipleship and missional theosis? I'll drop these 3 questions in the chat for the speakers again, so they have them if they'd like to reference them in the conversation.
Yeah, we can actually see them.
Yeah, we can see.
Great.
I'll start with this idea of abide. First of all, hey, TL, good to hear from you. Yeah, I love this notion of abiding. I was schooled, boot camped into Greek by Frank Gignac, who just the, insurmountable Frank Gignac. And he was very, the Greek word there, of course, is meno. And he was very insistent that it should be translated as abide. And he would, in his characteristic way, he would say abide, as opposed to something like remain or stay, because of just, I think, what you're suggesting, TL, that there's this, I like how you said this active passivity, that it's much more of an ongoing action. And now, and about the sort of abide and go, let me just be clear to properly credit Michael Gorman for that. That's me repeating him. Michael Gorman's little book on Joe and I Mission was very influential to me. Oh, there, Hugo's holding it up. Was very influential to me as I was, thinking through these things. And so he talks a lot about that idea of, again, maintaining, abiding in the relationship, not only with the ongoing presence of Jesus in your lives, but in the communities that you're forming, that sustains you as you go out. So I'll turn that over to my
I mean,
panel.
I think to add something to that, when you think about abiding presence, right? If you think about the entire structure of John, in chapter 1, the Spirit comes and abides, remains on Jesus. And of course, Jesus is very active over the next 21 chapters, right? So I think that the entire Gospel of John probably illustrates this principle of remaining is really about having the Spirit's presence to be active and to be sent out. And I think you really, giving credit to Michael Gorman, but also your work, Sherri, really illustrates that very richly.
Would
Shall we
anyone like to address the other two?
Yeah, we can start talking about the other. When I'll talk about doubting Thomas. I often joke with my students, poor guy has one bad day and gets a nickname for all eternity, right? But I think he's very important, in that in those post-resurrection accounts, because he gives voice to exactly what the evangelist is concerned about, right? This need to see in order to believe, and the reality that seeing, is not necessary, isn't possible, and so when Jesus appears to him, he says, he talks about those who have believed without seeing being qualitatively better off, and to continue on. I will say, I'm not suggesting a theme of discipleship in lieu of Christology. I want to be very clear about that. I think the two go together all the time, right? The vertical and the horizontal, the theological and the ethical are always in play in the Gospel of John.
Can I just jump in on this, because I just so chafe at the whole doubting Thomas label, right? I mean, the guy has the most exalted confession in the gospel, like my Lord and my God, the Greek equivalent of, Adonai Elohim, right? And here we are calling him doubting Thomas for 2,000 years. Nobody else is reported as, outside of the beloved disciple, nobody else is reported as not seeing and believing. There is this ostensible race to the tomb. Both Peter and beloved disciple see the same things. They see the grave clothes folded up. Neither of them see Jesus. Neither of them understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead, but the beloved disciple believed, right? Fantastic. It doesn't tell us that Peter didn't believe, but it doesn't comment on it. Really, even Mary's confession, Mary doesn't really confess him until she kind of sees him and realizes that it's him. So I sort of feel like this label is problematic. And yeah, he is at this climactic moment, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. I mean, that's coterminous with the Christian tradition outside of, these few people that are privy to have these resurrection experiences. So I agree with you, Sherri, that this Christology and discipleship go together. And I want to have a recuperative intervention for the doubting Thomas and create him into the confessing Thomas, if we can.
See, we've got a lot of people. We're making a list of all the people we need to recuperate and change their titles, right?
Do you want to tackle the forensic language one?
Well, I wouldn't mind actually just adding one thing as a kind of a question to that, Sherri. I mean, if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between Christology and discipleship, and you talked about there being a good relationship there. I'd be kind of curious to hear a little more of how you're conceptualizing that right now.
Well, I think Christology leads to discipleship in the sense, or to mission. You know, that there's that that through this sort of relationality, you know, these encounters with Jesus, these relationships that are forming across the gospel, that we as readers are learning more and more about Jesus at the same time that we're learning more and more about what it means to be a disciple. And the challenges, you know, of course, the first real challenge is presented, well, not the first real challenge, but these questions about what it means to be a disciple begin to come to a head, you know, as early as John 6, right? Where Jesus pushes, and many say, you know, this is a hard saying, who can believe it? And leave. And then Jesus challenges the 12 about where they stand. And so again, it's in Jesus teaching about himself, how he is the Christ, that we learn more and more about what it means to be a disciple. So yeah, I'm always going to be a sort of both and person when it comes to, you know, finding balance in, you know, in our interpretation of all these different, you know, components of theology. Yeah. Does someone want to deal with the forensic language? I think. Go ahead, Lisa.
Go, Sherri. You're good. I mean, I think it just goes to what you're saying. Like, I mean, as Jesus says, he faces trials, and so his disciples will too. I'm kind of curious. We keep saying Christology, and of course, John has a lot of Christology, but also the theocentricity of that Christology, right? Like, in a way, Jesus is emblematic of God's continual going, really, and reaching out, right? So at 2021, just as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. That in some ways, Jesus is this model. I mean, it sounds funny, but is the model disciple because he's the model apostle sent by the Father. So that it's, you know, and I know this just builds on what you're saying. It's not just Christology, but the theocentricity of it, right? Because the purpose of Jesus is coming is to show the way to the Father, like that it's something bigger. It doesn't just end with Jesus.
Yeah, I sometimes when I'm like working through the prologue, I joke about how, because I've, you know, with my students, if the class begins with teaching them about exegesis, what it, you know, what first the word, and then, you know, what it means. But then if you are, you know, working through the prologue, is it the last word or maybe the second to last word of the prologue, you know, is a form of exegeomai, which we usually, you know, translate that Jesus's mission is to make God known or to reveal God. But it is an interesting thing to bring out that that Jesus exegetes God. I mean, that's his whole job, right? Is to exegete God. And then John exegetes Jesus, and then we exegete John, and we all keep going, you know, in this tradition. So yeah, I agree with you 100%, even though we haven't really been focusing on that today, that it's, yeah, the relationship between God, you know, and as Father and Jesus as Son is so close that leads again to the establishment of this community. With regard to the forensic language, I mean, you know, there's a lot of forensic language in the sense of, I think about Andrew Lincoln's work on covenantal trial motif in the Gospel of John, and I've certainly played with that, especially in like 7 and 8, and later on. So I think it is really important, and that, and of course, you know, my dissertation, my first work on this is all about sort of the covenantal themes across the Gospel of John, even though the word itself is never used, but it's expressed through this teaching and relationality. So I think it's it's crucial, where you stand when it comes to, this Jesus on trial, truth on trial, as we say, is determinative of, who you are in relation to God and your own mission.
And it's true too that, the forensic language of the gospel is tied directly into that testimony language in the gospel, witness language in the gospel, right? I mean, this is, all along with the truth and lie language. I mean, it kind of forms one system as the authors develop it, so that you end up with really, this is what's at the center of discipleship, right? You're going to testify of what you have seen. You're going to testify of what you've experienced with Jesus. And so there's probably a link that's uniting those much more closely than we might think.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I agree. It's important.
So I want to kind of ask a little bit about something Hugo raised, and this is one of the major questions that we're trying to bring out in this event. So, and you talked about, so how does the gospel's concept of discipleship play out in the 21st century? And then you threw out a bunch of questions, and I hope I got them right, but it was just fascinating what you're asking here. So where is the community today? And does it require church attendance? Where does discipleship fit into that, as far as, because we all know what's going on with church today. People are, it's like the rats fleeing the sinking ship, almost. Not quite that bad, but and then can we be disciples without the church attendance or the church body or the church community? Are disciples called to a community organized or something like that? I can't remember the exact language you used, Hugo, but and then the last thing I think you threw out there was, what about our divided theological community, and how does the discipleship play into all of that? I think these are really important questions about the whole idea of discipleship in the 21st century and the church itself. So that's out there for all of you to jump at.
I'd like to hear from my panelists, my fellow panelists.
I don't know. I mean, spitballing here. I think, speaking frankly, with respect to these questions, my feet feel kind of firmly planted in midair. I admit to being discouraged by just the incredibly fraught discourse around what it means to call on the name of Christ in the United States in the 21st century, right? I mean, we're inundated with white Christian nationalism, which, I grew up in Southeastern Virginia, like 15 minutes away from where Archie probably is right now, in a cauldron, which is quite politically conservative, quite religiously conservative, and then it's a pro-military town because Norfolk is the largest naval installation in the country. And there's often this, even when I'm speaking with people from my childhood or people from my home church about these things, there's often a huge disconnect between what I mean and what they mean about what it means to follow Christ. And so much of it is wrapped up in this American civil religion that is so pro certain things that when we look at, yes, the ethics of Jesus that come out of the various narrative portraits in the New Testament, do we really reflect at all upon what it means? And I'm going away from John at this point, but what it means to turn the other cheek? I think there are certain things that we see when we start, parsing out the various teachings of Jesus in the Gospels and kind of analyzing their ethical content, or those things that we would consider to be paramount for discipleship. And they really drastically differ from what we see in American civil religion. And I find it to be a source of incredible, endless discouragement, in fact. And I guess I'm pontificating here. I really don't know how to answer the question as much as to say, if I'm suffering, so come join me on humanity's suffering bench and, join me, because it's deeply problematic. And I'm wounded for so many of my fellow Christians and along with them. And I've been wounded by them as a result of some of this discourse. So I don't know if any of that's helpful, but that's certainly what's going on in my sphere.
Yeah, I don't know how many of y'all do theological education with ministerial candidates, but that is constantly a conversation in my classroom, because that's always those are the questions my students are asking, because they're either already pastors or they want to be pastors. And a lot of them are processing and deconstructing a lot of that embedded theology and the church hurt, and then experiencing church hurt while they're going through their program, because they're learning how to translate what they're learning into their ministry. And, they're learning like we all are. So sometimes it works and sometimes it really doesn't. And depending on your church polity, the results can be catastrophic for students. So I don't know. We talk about this a lot. I sometimes think we just needed to be willing to explore different ways and maybe different language and different approaches to following Jesus. Like in my context, it's mostly Baptist, non-denominational Protestant. I have a few Catholic students, but only like one or two. And they get so focused on worship has to look like this. And I think a lot of it comes from breaking that apart and being less centered, at least in Protestant context, on the preacher and what the preacher is doing, what the preacher says, and more on really theocentric Christological revelation. And in a lot of my students' churches, the spirit is not discussed at all because we can't control the spirit. So having more willingness to go into these different avenues and even let go of some things in various contexts that aren't working anymore and that actually are being used, like you've seen, to oppress and silence any sort of resistance or reading of the Bible. So.
Yeah, I think I just tend to agree with what you all are bringing out. Here at Creighton, we have, I teach primarily undergrads, but our strong master's program is a master's in Christian spirituality in the Ignatian tradition, and we form spiritual directors. And it's so interesting to work with these folks and people who are drawn to becoming spiritual directors, but of course they usually come into it from engaging in spiritual direction. And this seems to be I'm very encouraged by it, and it seems to be something that people are really thirsting for and becoming more and more popular. And so it's not that folks are no longer, as we all know, I'm saying something that we all know, but it's not that people are no longer interested in faith or spirituality, even if they are leaving churches in droves, and so we have to consider that. And I think that John would suggest that he would have no concept of, sort of church organization as we know it today, except in sort of maybe the organized Jewish cultic life. And I think that he would say that we don't necessarily need, organized cultic life. And he maybe has experienced hurt in that regard, as some argue, he and his community, but that we need community, right? And we need people in each other, kind of along the lines of what you were saying, Alicia, finding new ways to experience this life together. Yeah.
I think that's really, really powerful to think about that. I mean, in the kind of reconstruction that would see the social matrix of the gospel being shaped by trauma, by disruption, by the need to reform community. I mean, that's You might have just found the J. Lewis Martin missing link to, kind of really the church application, right? That we miss, and telling this fine, easy, sectarian, Johannine community narrative against the world that may not grapple with, those kind of issues. I love that answer. That's great.
Have we just convinced Hugo that there was an actual Johannine community? Is that what you're saying? Or at least, at the very least, a social network of churches uniting around the Johannine message?
He'll never see. He's staying muted. He'll never agree.
We see Eric. What's going on, Eric? Hey, brother.
How you doing? Listen, thank you everybody for all the things that you've contributed to this discussion. This has been extremely enlightening and great to listen to. Sherri, thanks for a great book that started all this off.
My pleasure. It's been fun. I get to talk about John for 2 hours with my friends, right?
Amen. Amen. So listen, like Alicia, I teach a vast majority of my students are divinity students. So these are definitely the kind of questions that that come up. I teach at a Catholic seminary in Jerusalem. So in terms of the communal, or dare I say ecclesial dimension of discipleship and so on, in chapter 10, you have an image of a sheepfold, along with the caveat that I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. So an openness there and so on. When you talk about some of the great vocabulary, Sherri, that you deal with, like remaining or abiding, so the verb meno, so does that have a personal spiritual as well as a communal sociological aspect to it? When I remain, when I abide, does that put me on one side of the divide in John chapter 6, where those folks say, I've had enough of this, we're going? So in my moment, and for each of us in our personal moments of deciding, should I stay or should I go? Which decision do we make? Do we decide to remain in him as he does in the Father? Even the language of belief, the peculiar construction you find some places in the New Testament, as you do in John, where believing in someone leads you to the accusative case instead of the dative case. So instead of pisteuo ento Jesu, it's pisteuo eis ton Jesun, to believe into Jesus, as has been commented on in lots of publications and so on. Does that also have an ecclesiological dimension, that my connection with Jesus on a vertical level, to use Sherri's language, kind of concomitantly along with it brings me into that horizontal relationship with a lot of other people who are thinking and believing and reacting in similar terms and so on. Even if you look at the passage that you all spoke about of chapter 4 of the Samaritan woman, if you kind of trace through her step-by-step, cautious, but exemplary and paradigmatic process of coming to belief in Jesus, maybe y'all have heard me say before, final stage is communal. The final stage is communal, where she drags all those people back with her, and so therefore I would say that this topic is essential to the whole discussion of discipleship, and therefore its implications for the present context or past contexts or future contexts or contexts going on right now that you and I don't happen to know anything about, is these are crucial topics, crucial and important topics. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Eric. And I agree with Jeffrey Fawcett, his chat comment that I think all exegetical discussions need to include Clash lyrics. So always. So I think it's fantastic, and just hearing you talk. I mean, I love to hear you talk, and of course you've done such great work on the Samaritan woman, but that encounter. But it just brings to mind that old quote that people attribute to any number of different people, that the Gospel of John is like a magic pool, right? In which the infant can paddle and the elephant can swim, because, I chose for this little book to sort of go into this idea of discipleship through the imperatives and the relationality that ensues. But I mean, just sort of, there's never ending ways that we can explore this, with the Ace Ton Mission and the communal aspect of the culmination of a communal aspect to so many of these encounters. Yeah, so thanks.
Can I just ask a quick question? I'm just curious where everybody stands on this, because the whole question of ace, with the accusative here, my understanding is that in the Hellenistic era, like the semantic overlap between N with the dative and ace with the accusative is so significant as for there to almost be no distinction whatsoever, because N is so malleable and ace in so many different places replaces that. I have not regarded ace with the accusative there as having any real exegetical significance beyond just its typical sort of directionality that we've talked about previously with N and the dative. Do you guys have thoughts on that? Or does anybody have a specific stance on that?
I'll say that what I've said before, that I mean, and again, linguistics is not my forte. But certainly, we were, like you said, always taught about how so many of the semantic, what had been in classical Greek, these semantic diversions are gone by the time we get into Koine. And so, and Hugo's going to come on good and talk to us about the language, but I always I still want to defer to John's word choice, that because he uses such a small vocabulary overall, that he seems to be using words in very particular ways. And so I just think it's possible that even if generally speaking, there's no distinction between the two, or just like if generally speaking, there's no distinction between, agape and philia, or, any number of other things, that doesn't mean that John's not doing something with them. So I just kind of throw that out there.
I mean, I was just going to say, Chris, I think I've seen it the way that you do, thinking that there's really not much of a semantic distinction there. But I mean, I'd be kind of curious. Eric talked about a whole body of studies that he's aware of on this. So, we definitely haven't read all the literature that's out there on John. I'd be kind of curious to see, how that plays out. Thank you for bringing that up, Eric.
So I think we have a couple of more questions in the chat that Joshua is going to read for us. Correct, Joshua?
Again, I'll read two questions. One is from John Rurr, who asked the question a while ago. He posed, I'm intrigued by the concept of an author's audience. Narrow or broad, can audience be in the eyes of the reader only? I was thinking about his question, especially when you started talking about the exegetical practices. John is exegeting Jesus. We are exegeting John. I was thinking about audience then at that point as well, wondering what's a role the audience plays in that. Does the audience change? And do then the words need to be reinterpreted again for every new audience? So that's the first question. It's a big question. The second one is from Cleophas Lungu, who says, thanks, Sherri, and all for your expert and enlightening interventions. with regard to the horizontal or communitarian perspective of the call to discipleship in the fourth gospel, how can this be amplified in the liturgical context, especially in the Easter season? So a very practical question.
Somebody else want to start on this one? I want to defer.
I wanted to hear what you were going to say.
Who, me?
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about, and especially the second question from Cleophas. I think it's a great question, and it's in the particular sort of Catholic context and lectionary context in which there's a lot of John right now, and then coupling that with RCIA, or bringing people into the church. And I think I think it's really important. I think one of the ways in which we do people a disservice, whether it's, especially I think if it's kids, but also if it's adults, by bringing them into the church, by inundating them with the rules and regulations, right? That doesn't, I'm not sure that would work necessarily. And I think John's practice of bringing in relationship and community and sort of leaning on each other, working in and through one another could be very helpful in that context. And it's kind of putting sort of the rules and regulations a little bit, at least to the side, along the way. So that's, I don't know, that's one thing that I would think of. Maybe, even just like presenting these various encounters between Jesus, especially between Jesus and the women or the marginal, of people, in the various strata of society, and then having people sort of reflect on that and how it might play out, in their own lives today.
Yeah, it reminds me of, so with my Doctor of Ministry students, I used Anna Carter Florence's Rehearsing Scripture this year. And it was really good for them. And it was literally just reading the text and focusing on the verbs. And it's similar to, I don't know if you've all read Love Lazarus Seacrest's Race and Rhyme book, where she talks about associative reasoning. My students found that method extremely helpful of what, how do we translate these texts? And she says, it's not taking scripture literally, it's taking scripture seriously. And the trying to figure out what texts mean, how they translate in our contemporary context. So I do think there is this process of reinterpretation and retranslation. And we even find it within the biblical canon itself. And I think of Michael Fishbane's work. But yeah, I do think that's a responsibility that we have, and then especially that ministers, pastors, priests, everyone, has to make it speak still.
Can I jump in on the authorship question really quickly?
Yes.
Yeah. What did you say, Sherri?
I said, yes, please.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't have any definitive thoughts, but I think all of us are constantly wrestling with, we have the question of who was the quote unquote original audience. And of course, we're differing in this. Hugo's doing great work right now on questioning whether or not there was this Johannine community, which is a construct that's, been out there for a while, but what was the original audience? And then those of us who have done narrative or rhetorical approaches are constantly asking something about maybe the implied reader or the implied audience. And then we're also clearly today all showing a real interest in, a real concern for the contemporary world in front of the text. So we're constantly dealing with the world behind the text, the world of the text, the world in front of the text. So the question about audience, I think, is a difficult one to answer definitively. I think it all depends upon what perspective you're working from in terms of, I often say, I am trying to trace the internal rhetoric of the narrative in the communication from the implied author to the implied reader, the implied author to the implied audience. But I recognize that there were real readers, whether they were a part of a community or not, a social network or not. But also there are people who value this as normative all across the world every single day. So I'm not sure there's a definitive answer to that, but I think we as scholars who also have a concern for the ecclesial world have to constantly take these different audiences, these different constituencies into account when we're doing the work that we're doing. I don't know if that's a helpful answer or not, but that's what came to mind.
It was helpful to me, so thanks.
I just want to make the language you used, Sherri, about abide and go in relation to community, and the whole idea that the question was raised about liturgical context of, our RCIA program. I mean, I think that's really important to have that, because, you're talking about kind of two different aspects there of abiding in Christ, or Christ abiding in you, and then at the same time abiding in the community, but at the same time going out of the community to bring in more disciples, so to speak. So I think that language that you're using there is really important. I think it would really be helpful in that liturgical setting, and bringing in people who are coming into the church to grasp the concept of abide, and what exactly does that mean in their relationship with Christ as being disciples of Christ. I think that's really important. One of the just that alone, coming away from the book with that is really important. I think it's really outstanding.
I definitely think, Cleophas's question shows, I mean, probably that we're really kind of moving forward in the way that we're thinking about John, if we can think about how it applies in that liturgical season and what you can do with it in ecclesial homiletic context, right? I mean, we receive something very special on Easter. We're, framed with these initial Sundays that essentially are about at least the descent of the Spirit on Thomas Sunday. We're in a season that's building up to Pentecost. And so the Spirit's coming, the Spirit's remaining is all over the season. If one were to think about John as a text that is about creating a certain kind of disciple and integrating that disciple into community and into mission, then yeah, I think those are really powerful themes to bring out homiletically during this season. And again, if someone's inspired to do that, that's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, I hope people are hearing some good homilies this season since they've got John.
All right, we are coming to an end, so we just want to give Sherri the last couple minutes to kind of wrap things up for us. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being a part of this, and particularly for Josh for help setting it up, and for CBA being behind these new initiatives that we're doing with these things, promoting the scholarship of our members and bringing in a conversation. But Sherri, if you just want to kind of wrap things up for us, and then we'll say fare thee well.
Sure. Yeah. Again, I just want to thank everyone. I have enjoyed being part of this new series. There's a couple books coming out after me. I was just talking to Frank Maloney, and he's got his contribution on Matthew will be out before too long, I think, maybe before the end of this year. And it's a fantastic series. I mean, as I said, it was a challenge. Do all this in 35,000 words or less, but it was super helpful to me to go through that process. And I hope that it's helpful for the purposes that we intend. And I just really hope that this series continues to get out there into the community. And in addition, I want to thank Archie for inviting me again, and Joshua for your immense technical expertise. I think we'd be lost at this point without you. And then my panelists, my fellow panelists. I really laughed or smiled to myself when I heard that it was going to be Alicia, Chris, and Hugo, and I was like, oh, this should be fun. And it was fun. So thanks a lot for you all being there, and for all of you who participated in your fantastic questions. And as you know by now, CBA this summer will be here at Creighton, and we're getting ready. So I would really look forward to continuing these conversations this summer. So thanks so much. And I guess, you know, I'll close as John does, that, you know, the world is not big enough for all the books that are necessary to discuss Jesus and what God has done in and through Christ, but nonetheless, we can abide and go.
Thank you, Sherri. I just want to thank Sherri and Alicia and Hugo and Chris and of course Joshua. Thank you all very much.